In the early 19th century, Europe belonged to one man. Napoleon Bonaparte had done what generations of kings and emperors had failed to do. He had broken the old balance of power. He had crushed ancient empires, rewritten borders, and reshaped the laws of an entire continent. By 1806, Napoleon stood at the peak of his power, and yet the war was not over, because while Napoleon ruled the land, his greatest enemy ruled the sea. This is not the story of a famous battle. There is no Waterloo here. No cavalry charge, no final cannon shot. This is the story of how Napoleon fought the most ambitious economic war in history and lost everything because of it. By the year 1806, the map of Europe had been violently redrawn. The Austrian Empire had been shattered at Austerlitz. Prussia had been humiliated at Jena and Auerstedt. French troops had marched through Vienna and Berlin as conquerors. Napoleon's brothers now sat on foreign thrones. Joseph ruled Naples. Louis ruled Holland. Jerome ruled Westphalia. To an observer standing on the blood-soaked fields of Central Europe, it appeared that the war was finished. The French eagle flew from the Atlantic coast to the heart of Germany, but Napoleon knew the truth. He understood that victory was an illusion as long as one enemy remained untouched. Just 20 miles across the English Channel, Great Britain still stood defiant. Napoleon could conquer capitals, he could shatter armies, but he could not cross that narrow strip of water. The Royal Navy stood like a wall of oak and iron between France and the white cliffs of Dover. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 had changed everything. Napoleon's fleet was destroyed. France lost any realistic hope of invading Britain. From that moment on, the war entered a deadlock. Napoleon dominated the land. Britain ruled the sea. It was a clash of two different kinds of power. Napoleon was a master of armies. Britain was a master of finance, trade, and naval dominance. Napoleon once described the situation perfectly. He was a lion who could not swim, facing a shark who could not walk. The stalemate frustrated him deeply. He needed a new weapon. Napoleon despised Britain, but he also understood it. He believed Britain was not a traditional warrior nation. Its power did not come from massive land armies. Instead, Britain was a commercial empire. Its strength came from global trade routes, powerful banks, industrial factories, and the world's most dominant navy. Napoleon famously dismissed the British as a nation of shopkeepers, but behind that insult was a dangerous idea. Napoleon believed Britain's economy was fragile. He believed British power rested on trade like a house of cards. If that trade could be cut off, the entire structure would collapse. Factories would shut down, workers would riot, banks would fail. Britain would not fall to cannon fire, but to bankruptcy. Napoleon began to think differently about warfare. If Britain could not be defeated by soldiers, it would be defeated by money. He believed Britain depended heavily on European markets. Europe bought British cotton, iron, manufactured goods, and colonial products. If Napoleon could close Europe's doors to British trade, Britain would suffocate. No profits meant no taxes. No taxes meant no navy. No navy meant defeat. This was a radical idea. Wars had always been fought with armies. Napoleon intended to fight one with paperwork. In November 1806, Napoleon was staying in Berlin, the conquered capital of Prussia. From the palace of the defeated Prussian king, he made a decision that would change history. Napoleon took up his pen and signed the Berlin Decree. It was a declaration of total economic war against Britain. With a stroke of ink, Napoleon announced that the British Isles were under blockade. This was an extraordinary claim. Napoleon had no fleet capable of enforcing a traditional blockade. Normally, a blockade meant surrounding ports with warships. Napoleon did something entirely new. He inverted the concept of a blockade. Napoleon would not blockade Britain from the outside. He would blockade Europe from the inside. Under the new system, no ship coming from Britain or its colonies could enter any European port under French control. All trade with Britain was illegal. British goods found on the continent were to be seized and burned. British citizens in French-controlled territory were to be arrested. Napoleon called this grand strategy the Continental System. His vision was clear. Europe would become a sealed fortress. Britain would be locked out of its largest market. From Napoleon's perspective, the logic was ruthless but sound. Europe was Britain's biggest customer. If Europe stopped buying British goods, factories in Manchester and Birmingham would collapse, warehouses in London would overflow, unemployment would rise sharply. Public unrest would follow. Napoleon believed the British government would not survive such pressure. Britain would be forced to negotiate peace. The war would end not with a decisive battle, but with economic collapse. It was a siege not of a city, but of an entire economy. Napoleon sent orders across his empire. Customs officers were deployed from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. Every ship was to be inspected. Every wagon searched, every crate examined. The war had moved from the battlefield to the customs house. But Napoleon underestimated the difficulty of enforcing such a system. Europe's coastline stretched for thousands of miles. It was full of hidden coves, inlets, and small ports. To enforce the Continental System perfectly, Napoleon would have needed a soldier on every beach. That was impossible. Britain was not going to surrender quietly. The British government understood what Napoleon was attempting. They decided to respond with economic warfare of their own. They issued the orders in council. These orders declared that any ship trading with Europe must first stop at a British port. There, it would pay a fee and receive a license. Britain was effectively claiming ownership of the seas. If you wanted to trade, you had to go through Britain. This created chaos for global trade. Neutral merchants, especially from the United States, were trapped between two empires. If they obeyed Britain, Napoleon seized their ships in Europe. If they obeyed Napoleon, the Royal Navy captured them at sea. Legal trade became almost impossible. Prices of everyday goods skyrocketed. Coffee, sugar, and tobacco became luxury items. Across Europe, ordinary people began to grumble. Napoleon had promised glory. Instead, he had taken away their coffee. By the end of 1806, the economic war was fully underway. Napoleon believed he was strangling Britain. Britain believed it could outlast him. Neither side yet understood the scale of the disaster that was coming. By early 1807, Napoleon believed his plan was working. On paper, the Continental System looked unstoppable. Europe's ports were closed. British goods were banned. Trade was criminalized. But history is rarely decided on paper. The reality on the ground was very different. Almost immediately, cracks began to appear in Napoleon's economic fortress. And those cracks had names: greed, geography, and human nature. As soon as legal trade was shut down, illegal trade exploded. The demand for British goods never disappeared. Europe still wanted sugar, coffee, tobacco, cotton, manufactured textiles, and where demand exists, supply always finds a way. This was the beginning of what historians now call the golden age of smuggling. British merchants adapted faster than Napoleon expected. They understood something Napoleon did not. You can outlaw trade, but you cannot erase it. The British government established offshore smuggling hubs. The most famous was Heligoland, a tiny rocky island in the North Sea, near the Danish coast. It had no natural resources, no real population, no strategic value, except one. It sat just outside Napoleon's reach. If even one country allowed British goods to enter, they would spread across borders. Napoleon became obsessed with sealing every gap. This obsession would destroy him. Portugal was Britain's oldest ally. It refused to close its ports. Napoleon responded with force. In 1807, French troops marched through Spain to occupy Portugal. This decision triggered disaster. Spain erupted in rebellion. What Napoleon expected to be a short occupation turned into a brutal guerrilla war. French soldiers were ambushed daily. Supply lines were attacked. The war dragged on year after year. Napoleon later called Spain his ulcer. It drained men, money, morale, and it existed for one reason: enforcing the Continental System. Napoleon also turned on his own family. His brother Louis, King of Holland, refused to fully enforce the blockade. He sympathized with Dutch merchants. Napoleon forced him to abdicate. Holland was annexed directly into France. Napoleon sent his own customs officers to patrol Dutch canals. He was dismantling alliances to protect an economic policy. By 1810, Europe was exhausted. Napoleon's allies obeyed out of fear, not loyalty. Smuggling continued. Resentment grew. Napoleon ruled more territory than ever, but controlled it less. The Continental System was no longer strangling Britain. It was strangling Europe. The greatest irony was yet to come. Napoleon began preparing for his greatest military gamble, an invasion of Russia. To do so, he needed to equip 600,000 soldiers. France could not produce enough boots or coats. The solution: buy them from Britain. In secret deals approved by the British government, British manufacturers sold boots and coats to France. They took Napoleon's gold and used it to finance the war against him. The Grand Army marched east wearing boots made in Northampton, coats woven in Yorkshire. The economic war had become absurd. By 1811, the truth was undeniable. The Continental System was failing. Britain endured. Europe suffered. Napoleon grew more desperate. By 1810, Napoleon's grand economic experiment was unraveling. The Continental System had failed to crush Britain. But it had succeeded in something else. It was tearing Napoleon's own empire apart. Nowhere was this more obvious than in Russia. After the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Tsar Alexander I had joined Napoleon's blockade against Britain. On paper, France and Russia were allies. In reality, the partnership was built on economic pain and political fear. Russia was not an industrial economy like France or Britain. It was agrarian. Its wealth came from exporting timber, hemp, grain, tallow, and for decades, Russia's largest and most reliable customer had been Great Britain. When Alexander closed Russian ports to British ships, he effectively strangled his own economy. The consequences were immediate. Exports collapsed, state revenue dried up. The value of the ruble plummeted, losing nearly half its worth. Meanwhile, French luxury goods flooded Russia, expensive and unwanted. The Russian nobility felt humiliated. They believed they were paying tribute to Paris while their own economy crumbled. Alexander found himself in a dangerous position. His father, Tsar Paul I, had been assassinated by his own courtiers, partly because his foreign policy damaged Russian trade. Alexander feared the same fate. He began to quietly undermine the Continental System. Alexander did not openly defy Napoleon. Instead, he bent the rules. He issued decrees that restricted French luxury imports. At the same time, he turned a blind eye to neutral ships, especially American vessels, entering Russian ports. Everyone knew the truth. Those ships often carried British goods. But Russia needed the trade. Napoleon noticed immediately. To him, the world was binary. You were either loyal or an enemy. There was no middle ground. Napoleon wrote furious letters to the Tsar. He accused Alexander of betrayal. He warned that if Russia was allowed to cheat, the entire Continental System would collapse. Other nations would follow. Britain would win. Napoleon believed he had no choice. Russia had to be forced back into obedience, at gunpoint. This is the great tragedy of 1812. Napoleon did not invade Russia to conquer land. He did not want Moscow. He did not want the Russian steppes. He invaded Russia to enforce a trade embargo. It was a military campaign launched for economic policy. In June 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. More than 600,000 soldiers. They came from France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Holland, and dozens of other territories. This was not just a French army. It was an imperial army marching to enforce Napoleon's will. Napoleon expected a quick campaign, a decisive battle, a forced treaty. He had no intention of marching deep into Russia. As Napoleon advanced east, something crucial happened behind his back. The Continental System collapsed. With Napoleon's forces tied down in Russia, enforcement weakened across Europe. Smugglers grew bolder. British goods flooded the Baltic ports. The very thing Napoleon went to war to prevent was happening because he went to war. History delivered its cruelest irony. The Russian campaign became a nightmare. The Russian army retreated, refusing battle. Supply lines stretched endlessly. Moscow burned. Then came winter. The retreat destroyed the Grand Army. Hundreds of thousands froze to death, starved, or deserted. Only a shattered remnant escaped Russia. But the human disaster was only part of the story. Napoleon's defeat shattered the myth of his invincibility. Europe had obeyed him because they feared him. Now that fear was gone, Prussia rose in rebellion. Austria switched sides. Sweden joined the coalition. These nations were not only fighting for independence. They were fighting to escape economic strangulation. They wanted British subsidies, British markets, access to global trade. Again, Britain had survived the Continental System. Now it weaponized its wealth. The British government poured millions of pounds into Europe. Gold flowed to Russia, Prussia, Austria. British factories produced muskets, uniforms, and gunpowder. British banks financed entire armies. The economic power Napoleon failed to destroy was now used to destroy him. In 1813, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Europe at Leipzig. It was the largest battle the continent had ever seen. Napoleon was defeated, not only by numbers, but by exhaustion. Europe was tired of war, tired of trade restrictions, tired of economic experiments. The Continental System had united Napoleon's enemies. In 1814, Allied armies marched into Paris. Napoleon abdicated. One of the first acts of the new government was symbolic. They abolished the Continental System. The decrees were torn down. Customs officers were dismissed. Ports were reopened. British ships sailed into French ports for the first time in years. They were greeted with cheers. Merchants rushed to buy. Coffee, sugar, cotton prices collapsed overnight. For ordinary people, it felt like liberation. No more substitutes, no more scarcity. The economic siege was over. The Continental System was a failure, but it changed the world. It proved that economic power could rival military power. Napoleon was a military genius. He won battle after battle. But he lost the war because he did not understand markets. You can command an army. You cannot command supply and demand. The blockade forced innovation. Europe developed. Beet sugar production, new textile industries, some survived. Many collapsed once British competition returned. The lesson was clear. Artificial markets do not last. Britain emerged stronger than ever. The Bank of England became the financial center of the world. The Royal Navy ruled the seas uncontested. Trade networks expanded into Asia, South America. The Continental System forced Britain to become a global empire. Napoleon spent his final years on St. Helena. A prisoner of the Navy he could never defeat, he insisted the system would have worked. If only Russia had obeyed. If only Spain had remained quiet. But he never understood the flaw. Trade is like water. You can build a dam. But eventually, the water rises and breaks through. The smugglers of Heligoland, the bankers of London, the bootmakers of Northampton, they carried no muskets. Yet they defeated an emperor. They proved one timeless truth: the ledger is mightier than the sword. And that is how Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, victor 100 battles, was defeated by economics. This is the Finance Historian Time channel. Subscribe, like, and comment to stay ahead of the curve. Because empires don't fall loudly. They fall quietly until it's too late.